Good evening, everyone. I am that Weems guy back here for another episode. And a thought occurred to me. I've been asking all of you to share the link with your smart friends, but not sharing with your dumb ones. Well, if none of your friends have shared the link to the show with you, you're their dumb friend. And I hate to be the one to break that to you, but that's just the way it is. So maybe you need to talk to your friends and come to a meeting of the minds on that. But joining us tonight, Tom Givens. How you doing, Tom?
I'm great. How are you tonight?
I am rolling. For those who aren't aware of you, and I don't know how they could be not aware of you and be listening to this show, who is Tom Givens?
Well, that's a good question. I'm a full-time trainer. Started teaching part-time in 1975, long before you were born, and started teaching full-time in 1996, 25 years ago. So I'm thinking about making a career of it.
Well, there you go. I was born in 75. I hadn't been around long, but I had been born there. All right. Well, I'm very familiar with the Rangemaster Doctrine, but I'm curious as the path you took to developing that doctrine, because I know it just didn't appear overnight.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a long story.
Well, good. We've got plenty of internet.
Yeah, grew up in Memphis on the last street before the city limits. And from the end of my street for several miles beyond that was undeveloped river bottom, just basically just woods. No homes in them, no paved roads, no anything for miles and miles and miles. So every summer I pretty much just lived in the woods. And during hunting season was out there the whole time. Pretty much grew up as a woods rat, which included guns, plinking with 22s and hunting game with shotguns and whatnot. And spent a great deal of time doing that. So I started shooting pretty early. I think I got my first BB gun when I was like 6, my 22 when I was about 12, and my first pistol at 16. So started shooting pretty early. Memphis back then, of course, we're talking about over 50 years ago, had a branch of the public library system called the Technical Library. And all it had were technical books, oddly enough, but they had an entire section on firearms that included General Hatcher's works, textbooks of pistols, revolvers, and Hatcher's notebook and all of his major books. Had Charles Askin's books from 1939 on pistol shooting, and quite a few others. Applegate's, let's see, Jordan's. They had pretty much all the old heads from the 20s, 30s, 40s had their books there. So as a teenager, I started reading those. Of course, we're talking about in the 60s, so they're 40 years old to 50 years old at that point. So I tried to self-teach myself to use a pistol based on material in those old books. It wasted, I don't know, a truckload, probably closer to a train load of ammunition trying to master these various techniques, and stumbled around. And then in the late 60s, I stumbled across Jeff Cooper's writings and started trying to follow his advice. Got my first 1911 when I was 16, and started hand loading for it so I could shoot it enough to gain any kind of skill with it. So by the time I was sworn in the Army in 1970, I had already been playing with 1911s for several years, and got some, quote, training, unquote, on the weapon, and realized, well, I know more about this than these people do. And then the same thing with police training. After that, I was just appalled at still being taught crap I'd been reading about as a teenager from the 30s and 40s. And that continued. So I finally just got disgusted. I said, well, if nobody else is going to do it, I'll just have to start teaching. So that's why I started teaching part-time in 75. This is kind of a sideline. Went through all the institutional schools, NRA, law enforcement, firearms instructor, tactical shooting instructor, been through the FBI school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But any meaningful training, I got it all. I got in the private sector on my own dime, my own time. And I was appalled by that. So I started to a quest, you might say, to try to find a system that does work and codify it and pass it on to other people. So that's where the doctrine grew out of. I just saw such a need for training that wasn't just total nonsense, basically, just unproductive. And you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. Just no effort made to make competent gunmen out of people. Let's just check the box, send them on, get the next class, and here's so we check the box and send them on. And if you've been around for any length of time at all, it's just no surprise at all that people whose only training is from those institutions don't do well in the field. Wouldn't expect them to.
Before we go down the path of the training that you sought out, I want to kind of give an illustration to the audience of some historical context here. What people may not realize is that prior to 1968, you could mail order guns. And you've told me a great story about that. If you're willing, I would love for you to repeat that here.
No. No.
Okay.
Well, let's just say it was a different world in the 60s.
Yeah. Yeah, folks, prior to 1968, you could order guns out of Sears catalog, JCPenney catalog, and have it shipped right to you.
Actually, my first semi-automatic rifle was a nylon 66 Remington from Sears. And the U.S. postman came to the door, rang the doorbell. When I opened the door, he handed it to me, got back in his Jeep and drove off. Of course, prior to 68. And I thought, well, that's neat. And my first handgun was bought in person, but there was no paperwork or anything. It was just my father handed them some cash. They handed me the pistol. We go out the door. Today, it'd be considered a straw purchase, but it was before GCA 68. It was the way you got a gun in those days.
Yep.
And had quite a few other little adventures like that with firearms before the Gun Control Act. Yeah, I was already hanging around gun shops at that time. It's amusing me to look back on it. Southern planners and whatnot would come in the gun shop and say, I'll take that one right there. So, well, here we need to fill out this government form. What? We need to fill out this government form. Blank you. I'm not filling out blank government forms, and turn around out the door they go. And now people go to shop, so we got to fill out this form and do this and do that. And so that's all I got to do. And the other society's just changed a great deal over the last 50 years.
Yeah, I grew up in a small farming community, and I remember you go to the feed house and they're sold ammunition at the feed store. So
when I was a kid, every hardware store where I bought most of my ammunition that I bought for myself was from a tire store that also had an FFL and had ammunition and a few guns, mostly had ammunition. And just say how silly it is that after GCA 68, you had to actually show ID and they had to log into a logbook when you bought ammo, not just as if you were buying a gun today, basically. That was done away with in the 80s. But at that time, you had to do that. So my father went down there and gave the guy driver's license and everything one time. And then from then on, I'd just go in and buy the stuff and they'd write down the same information and get in the box. Silly regulations require silly evasions. But they just kept his information on file. And every time I went in and buy some 45 hardball from them, they just wrote the same information down the book and sent me out the door. He sent a 17-year-old kid out the door with it. Somebody finally realized that had no effect whatsoever on anything. So creating a paperwork burden on people.
Yeah, if I knew my father was going to the feed store on the way home to pick up stuff for the horses, I would beg him to bring me a box of Winchester Wildcat 22. And, so sometimes, like about every 3 or 4 times, he'd actually bring me a box that would last the next day. And because I go out outside and shoot it all up. And then there was a convenience store in town that sold ammunition. So you could stop, buy a few gallons of gas, run inside, get a Coke and a box of 22s and head home.
Yeah, when I was a teenager, box 20, 50 round box of 20 long rifles was 29 cents. Yeah. And of course, 29 cents was harder to come by, but I got a few yards to do whatever. I've done some kind of work from the age of 15 on, and make a little money, go buy some ammo, burn it up. That's if I could have back the ammo I wasted and all that trial and error stuff in those days, I'd never have to buy another round of ammo the rest of my life.
Yeah, I was prone to go out in the pasture, and if the horses weren't in the direct line of fire, I would shoot ant beds just because I
Mhm,
like watching the big cloud of red dust. And
mhm,
tell me how many boxes of 22 I went through doing that.
yeah.
All right. So what was firearms training like in the academy for you?
Oh, it sucked. Of course, this is in the days when we had revolvers, and they had just started making the transition away from thumb cocking for everything. NRA police pistol competition, as we know it today, didn't start till 1960, so it was just getting firmly established by the time I came along. So they had just made the change over to double action shooting as the norm, except at 50 yards, and still loading out of dump pouches, which allowed you to dump your rounds on the ground efficiently. So then you could pick them up and get them into the gun somehow. Time limits had to be glacial because of the equipment. If you're loading loose rounds from a dump pouch, you had to have lots of time to do it. So you look at the time limits from the courses of those days today and just think, oh, what any one-eyed, three-fingered jackass could do that. Well, not necessarily when you're using a revolver and loose rounds that are all oriented the wrong way and trying to get them in the cylinder and still get your hits. So no emphasis on any of the tenets of marksmanship that we think of today. Really, it's just basically it's just you're jerking the trigger. Stop doing that, and eventually you get to where you can shoot the double action revolver well enough to pass. I could tell early on that this is not adequate.
What revolver did you carry through the academy?
Model 10 heavy barrel.
As God intended.
Just like everybody else. Yeah, just like everybody else.
There you go. All right. So you realize that this academy training is useless and you've got to go out and start searching for something else. Where did that path
Well,
start?
like I said, I discovered Cooper's writings after everybody else's. So I started corresponding with him. This is back in the day when if you wanted information, so you sat down, wrote him a nice formal letter. And Jeff answered every letter I ever sent him, starting, I guess, in my late teens. And I'd ask him questions. He would give me detailed answers, and I'd go try the stuff out. His early books, the 1960 something book that Outdoor Life put out, that has Jack O'Connor and a couple of other people plus Jeff handling the handgun section of it, was pretty much my guidebook, you might say, to get started at that time. And then by the late 70s, I actually managed to get the gun sight and get the training in person. But went through the 499, which was the highest class they taught at the time in 1980. So by that point, I was pretty well entrenched in what he called that time the modern technique.
All right. Did Cooper himself teach that class?
Yeah. Actually, when I went through the 499, Jeff was the lead instructor. Chuck Taylor was number 2. Dennis Tuller was number 3, and Barry Sabelski from the Houston Police Department was number 4. I had the dream team, and had a lot of real high-speed guys in that class, including Jean-Pierre Denis, who wound up being the world president of IPSC for several years, and several other people. And really a good, very intense 5 days, 5.5 days.
All right. Where did you go after that?
Well, after that, I tried to get around to as many training opportunities as I could. I think the first time I trained with Farnham was 1977. So that's a good long ways back. He was, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking John was the first of the itinerant traveling trainers. It actually wasn't. Cooper was. Cooper taught in Latin America, Europe, South Africa, Rhodesia, several other places in the 60s, and used some of that experience as a formation, the foundation when he formed Gun Sight in 75. And first opened up, I think the first classes were actually in 76, if I'm not mistaken. And so Farnham had trained with Jeff at that point and decided to go on the road. Back then, Farnham worked for a company called Doctrine and had some of the first electronically controlled targets that could pop up. They could even come up with double-sided. You could make them come up as a foe this time and as a non-shoot the next time. And pretty sophisticated stuff. But back in those days, of course, it was all hardwired. So it required a truck full of equipment and a couple of days of setup. But John traveled around literally the world, not just the U.S., with that stuff, conducting training. That was some of the first training of that type that I got, like I said, in the late 70s. Then started when I opened our own range in 96, when I decided to be a full-time trainer. And I started bringing in outside people about once a quarter. So over that 18-year period, I got to train with probably 40 different trainers, which is very nice. I will bring them into my range and actually observe what they do and get a really good feel for that. And, for about 6 years, give or take, I was on the masthead of SWAT magazine, and my column every month, every issue, was to go to a school and write them up for the magazine. And, that's a dream job for a trainer. I got to travel around and steal, audit how other people do things and work that into our programs. So the things that we teach today are kind of an amalgamation going back to Cooper in the 70s up through all these other trainers that I've seen over the years, probably about 40 total. Then we take a little snippet from this, a little nugget from that, and work it into our program. So it's a kind of when a student comes and takes a class with us, they're kind of getting the best bits from damn near everybody in the business. I think I was like the second person to host Craig Douglas for an open enrollment class when he first started teaching outside police circles, for instance, and quite a few other people over the years. So that had a lot of influence on Doctrine. Whenever we bring in an outside trainer, or I go take somebody else's class, which I still do now. By this time, obviously, I'm not going to get a whole lot of new material, but I'm always looking for that one nugget in the class that I can take back and work into our program. Pretty much able to do that pretty much everywhere we go. Over the last 2 years, we closed the range in 2014 and just took the whole show on the road full time. Since then, I've trained with Gabe White a couple times, Ernest Langdon, several other people that I've been able to go and take a class from. I try, but you know yourself how hard it is. I try to get a class or two every year from somebody outside my own organization, but don't always make it. This year was tough because I lost a month and a half to the COVID earlier in the year. I was in the hospital for 6 days, and then I had to cancel 2 sold out classes, which just killed me. Not financially, just I hate doing it. And so I wasn't able to take any outside training this year, except what we got at the tactical conference. One of the nice things about running the tactical conference is this year we've got, I think, 42 or 3 trainers. And I'll get around and get at least a little bit of every one of them during the course of that 3 days. I won't get to take a full class with many of them, but I'll get to go around and sit in their classroom area or go watch them on the range for a while. So I still get a pretty good feel for what's going on with literally dozens of trainers every year since we do that event every year. I get to see pretty good spectrum of skills, both firearm and other skills as well.
All right. Since we've mentioned the tactical conference, how did that come into being?
Well, part of my involvement with Cooper, he was a real strong believer in competition, both as a means of developing skill, but also as a means of finding out what works and what doesn't. When they first started what later became IPSC, the International Practical Shooting Confederation, which in 1981, the U.S. part of that became USPSA. Before that, it was just IPSC. Unrestricted, meaning different kinds of guns compete against each other. They're not broken down into divisions or whatnot. Cooper felt that was the best way to find out what is the best equipment, what works best, what technique works, what equipment works under not fighting conditions. Nobody claims that, but the stress of peer pressure and performance anxiety and whatnot does give you a much better idea of how your techniques and your equipment hold up than say a practice session, for instance. So I was involved in setting up IPSC, which was formed, I think, in '77. And I was original section coordinator at the time. The Tennessee and Mississippi were combined into one section, which is how the USPSA is broken down, and kind of the whole country is broken down into sections. So I was the original section coordinator for that area, and set up IPSC matches in Tennessee and in Mississippi, and shot at them pretty much shot a match every weekend in one state or the other for a couple of years. And we got a lot of early progress made. Got a lot of really top shooters got started during that time frame that went on to become well-known trainers. Jerry Barnhart, John Shaw, for instance, those were guys that were in the very early days with me and went on to become real well-known later on as competitors. Being not a very bright learner, very quick learner, I guess, in the 90s, Bill Wilson and Ken Hackthorne and a few other people decided to try to go back to the original roots. IPSC in 77, 78, 79, 1980 didn't look anything like what it's evolved into now, with a bigger emphasis on really high round count stages, a lot of movement, a lot of athleticism. What some of the old guys, Bill Wilson, Ken Hackthorne, were right there at the very beginning, as was I in IPSC. So they wanted to start a different venue that would go back kind of to the roots of a gun you might actually carry on the street, rather than a hugely oversized match pistol with a huge optic on it, which, optics in the 80s weren't like they are today. Had to be worn in a special rig that you couldn't wear anywhere but on a pistol range. So the guys wanted to start or restart, you might say, a little more relevant competition, which is where IDPA came from. So I was involved in setting that up. My IDPA number is A00008. So I'm the 8th person involved in it, and spent 2 years on the board of directors of that in its early formative days, trying to get that off the ground. And so we decided to have a winter championship match at my range in Memphis. Since it was an indoor facility, they gave us an opportunity to have a major match that wouldn't be affected by the weather. For the most part, USPSA and IDPA both kind of shut down from usually around October, November until the next spring, because in much of the country on outdoor ranges, it's just not feasible to run a pistol match during the winter. So I said, well, I've got an indoor facility. I've got a fair bit of room here. We got more than one range. We got more than one classroom. We got large restrooms. So we could put on a fairly large event here. So the first time we did that, it was strictly just an IDPA winter championship, and the people came from literally all over the country to compete in it. This is in its, just like the second year of IDPA's existence. But because of the constraints of an indoor range, we had to have people kind of stand around waiting to shoot an awful lot. Could only shoot a few people at a time, and sometimes we can only shoot one person at a time in the match. So after that first year, it dawned on me, if you look around, the people who are attending this, an awful lot of them are professional trainers. I got classroom areas. I got area upstairs where we do hand-to-hand work and whatnot that we can also turn into a classroom. Why don't I coerce some of these people into putting on some seminar-like training, so that the people waiting to shoot aren't just standing around waiting to shoot. They can actually get some value out of the time. And out of that simple idea evolved the tactical conference. After the first year, the training aspect of it was so much more important than the shooting match part that the emphasis kind of switched over to that. And having been in the business as long as I have, I know everybody. So it's not that hard to come up with trainers who want to participate. And so over the next few years, the emphasis shifted over from being a match with training on the side, being a training event with a match on the side, which is what it is now, which is, to me, a much smarter use of resources. Of course, it's grown to the point now we've had to move it several times. A couple of times we did it at the Memphis Police Academy, which is a huge, fairly new complex, one of the nicest police ranges in the Southeast. And that worked pretty well for us. We went out to the United States Shooting Academy in Tulsa, I think twice. Put them on out there. That worked out pretty well for us. Tried various venues like that. Went to Direct Action Resource Center in Arkansas, primarily a government type training center, but it worked out pretty well for us. But last year and again this year, we were at the Dallas Pistol Club in Dallas. That's worked out perfectly for us. That's a very large facility, about a dozen live fire ranges, multiple classrooms. Of course, we bring in the tents for additional classroom work. But Dallas is within about a 4-hour flight at just about anywhere in the continental U.S. It's within driving distance of most of the population of the U.S. It's a really good range facility. I got an excellent staff that supports us. 10 minutes away is a conference center, convention center, with plenty of hotels and restaurants and whatnot around. So it's worked out perfectly for us. So now it's a major training event. We have, as I said, I think 42 trainers this year, with 8 or 9 tracks going on concurrently all over the place, in addition to the match, which to me is just a side event, really. You can go shoot a match anytime, but it's not very often you're going to have over 3 dozen nationally known trainers in one spot willing to teach you 2 and 4 hour blocks as part of your entry. It's the deal of the century as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, remember my very first TAC Con, I went, just as a pure student participant, and I got assigned my shooting time. And I'm looking at the class schedule. It's like, well, I guess I'm not shooting the match because I'm not giving up any one of these classes to go shoot the match. And then the very first time that I presented at TAC Con, I remember looking at the schedule going, if I wasn't teaching my block, there's nowhere in the world I would be in my block, because I would be in any one of these other 3 classes. And so I think that's one of the challenges of going sometimes, is picking what you're going to take.
Yeah. The only complaint I ever get is I didn't get to do everything I wanted to do. Well, bingo. It's, there's 3 days. I really can't ask these guys to work 24 hours a day. We generally run from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening. And you're not going to be able to do everything. It's just simply impossible. If we had a 5 or 6 or 7 day event, you'd get to do most of what you want to do. But in 3 days, you just have to prioritize, try to get the things that are the most important to you. Or you can do like I have to do, which is flit around and get 30 minutes of this guy and run over and get 30 minutes of that guy, which is not, for an attendee, is not what I would suggest. But you just have to prioritize your needs. If you're deficient in your training in some specific area, then you pick out some blocks that enhance that. You can't do everything. It's not possible.
What I try to, go ahead.
I think I can't remember for certain, there are 76 or 78 separate training blocks over that 3-day period for the one coming up this March. Tiffany and I are working on the schedule right now. I believe it's either 76 or 78 separate blocks, 2 and 4 hour blocks. So obviously you can't do 76 2-hour blocks or 76 4-hour blocks in 3 days. It's not possible. But you can get a live fire block with somebody that you wanted to train with, and an opportunity to go get some legal information from Ayub or Branco, which is something most people have to travel and pay a lot of money to get. Go get some hand-to-hand work with Cecil Birch or Larry Lindeman. Go get some medical work from Dr. Sherman House or from Caleb Causey. So if you prioritize and pick, well, this is important, I'm going to do this, and in that other field I need that, and this other discipline I need that. That's how you maximize the benefit of being there. Plus, people tell me all the time that the biggest benefit of attending is just networking with 300 other like-minded people that don't automatically think you're crazy or weird because of your interests. You have 300 other people there who share the same interests. So it's a real good networking opportunity. People a lot of times find out about somebody that lives in the same area as them, that trains and does all the same things, but they've never heard of each other because, like if you live in Houston, you're one of 6 million other people that live in Houston. So it's a good opportunity for people to meet other people and network.
Yeah, to that point, I remember one of the years we were at the Memphis Police Academy, and there was that big central hallway that everybody kind of gathered in between classes.
There's always mob in there.
I remember I had come out of one class, walked out in the hallway, and there was a gaggle of people standing there talking, and I kind of eased up to that circle, and it came time for the next class to start. And students went off to the various classrooms where that gaggle of people were all presenters who weren't presenting at that moment, and they were standing around having a conversation. I ended up just standing there for the next 2 hours listening to that, just because it was as good as any class I could have gone to.
Sure, sure. Yeah, if you think about the trainer lineup, there are literally thousands of years of experience there. I made a crack last year at the trainers dinner. There's over 200 years experience here just at Farnham's table. But really, it really wasn't a joke. It Farnham, Masada, you, Marty Hayes, and
Martin Topper.
Martin, and I think one more is going to be mad at me for not remembering.
Yeah.
But that's a couple hundred years of operational and training experience sitting at that one table out of what, 10 or 12 tables.
Funny that you mentioned that, because that was the first year that I presented. And so we come into the presenters dinner, and I'm the new guy. I didn't know exactly what to do. So I go over to this corner table where there's nobody sitting, and I just go sit down over there thinking I won't be in the way. Well, in comes you, Farnham, Martin Topper, all these guys, and they come, can we sit here? Sure. And they sit down, and I'm looking around at this table, and I get, there's somebody that doesn't belong at this table, and it's me. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, this must the closest comparison I could make would have been like a second lieutenant in World War II that somehow wound up sitting at a table with Patton and Eisenhower and all those guys. And I just kept telling myself, don't knock over your drink. don't do anything that reminds them that you're here, so they won't tell you to get up and leave. Just sit here and listen.
I've been in that same boat back in 78 or 79, I don't remember which. Jim Hagenbob and I spent an entire evening in a booth in a bar, just 4 people, he and I, Jeff Cooper and Jim Cirillo. And Jim and I kept remarkably quiet for several hours and just listened to Cirillo and Cooper. And that was one of the most educational evenings I've ever thought. I would have paid a lot of money for that. It didn't cost me a thing but a couple of drinks. But I would have paid a lot of money for that. And I would love to be able to do that again. There were a couple of, you're talking about a lot of experience. There's a great deal, both operational and training experience right there at that table.
Yeah.
So magnify that by 40 something trainers at the tactical conference, and you get a pretty good idea what we're talking about.
Well, Hearn and I had a similar experience having dinner with you and Spalding. So
yeah. Dave's my anorexic little brother.
That was a fun experience as well.
Yeah.
One last thing on the TAC Con, I guess one suggestion that I would have for attendees is pick a theme and try to get like every class that deals with that theme. Like my first year, I was in the process of setting up a training program for an agency. And so I went to every block that had anything to do with setting up and establishing a training program. And then if there wasn't something in that theme during the time frame, then I would find something else of interest. But I came away with a lot of information on that, and it kind of helped me zero in and formulate on where I was going.
Yeah. A lot of people that show up at an event like that have already got a fair bit of gun training. They've been to several shooting schools. They go shoot on their own. Sometimes they compete, sometimes they go just practice. But they've actually gotten enough of that. But here's a rare opportunity for both Mass AU and Branco, both are going to be delivering fairly large legal blocks. Most of the guys that they've got plenty of firearms training are really weak in that area. Most people are just full of misinformation about what you can and cannot do with your firearm. So I would really suggest take advantage of that. The other thing young people tend to be weak on is the immediate first aid for serious injury, traumatic injuries. Anytime, I'm frankly a little surprised that it's not a more common problem with people doing dynamic things on range with pistols, a lot of them without a lot of prior training. And we don't have more medical emergencies on ranges than we do. You know, I've personally taught almost 50,000 students over my career without a single gunshot, but I have sent people to the hospital. Had people stick knives through their hands trying to open a carton of ammo. Heat injuries are not terribly uncommon. You know, your typical student nowadays works in an air-conditioned cubicle sitting on his butt, picking on a keyboard, and not used to being on their feet for 8-9 hours at a time out in the heat and whatnot. So heat injuries are fairly common. And people step in holes and turn ankles and whatnot. So the actual incidence of gunshots during gunshot wounds during class is not high, but it can be a really catastrophic injury. It's kind of like why we wear a gun in the first place. You know, most days I'm not going to need my gun, but if I need them, I need it really, really, really bad. And the same way with that trauma management. If you have somebody shot, a lot of ranges are somewhat remote locations, so that we can put a range there, and that initial care that somebody gets can make the difference between crippling injury or being in the hospital in a couple of days, or can even the difference between being dead and not being dead. And here's an opportunity. You know, Dr. Sherman House, Caleb Causey, both of them are going to be doing medical blocks geared toward the kind of injuries that you would find on range, and you find that bleeds over to real life. I mean, I know several people who have taken some of that type of training, and then very shortly afterward witness a horrific traffic crash and pull somebody out of a car that would bleed to death had they not applied a tourniquet immediately. Well, they wouldn't have applied a tourniquet if A, they didn't have one with them, and B, somebody hadn't taught them how to use it. So to me, that's a really, if you're weak in that area, this is a perfect opportunity to get some exposure to that. So between the legal aspects and the medical aspects, a lot of people could get all their benefit could get what they paid for just attending that, and then take whatever time's left to go do shooting related crap. Because like I said, you shoot any weekend you want to, but this other stuff is hard to come by. I think being smart about managing your time at TAC Con is the best approach. Not just show up and go here and there, but find out what am I deficient in, what do I need to be shored up in, and go work on that instead of just randomly wandering around. A lot of people who carry a gun don't have any empty hand skills. You need to have something in between a harsh word and a pistol. Not every problem is going to require shooting, but may require more than just, hey, you stop that. Being able to defend yourself without a firearm would be a pretty useful skill. We got people who are really good at it. We got world-class competitors like Cecil Burke's going to be teaching. And again, not in the sport jiu-jitsu mode, simple moves that anybody can learn that can just keep you from being knocked out. For instance, as Southnar points out, if in the opening gambit you're knocked out, your gun skills don't matter anymore. Your gun is not yours anymore. It belongs to the guy that knocked you out. So if you don't have a strong suit in that would be a good place to put some time in at the event. So you got all of these different disparate trainers there with all these skills. And one of the things we started decades ago was trying to look at this from a more integrated standpoint. Not just have the gun guys over there and the hands-on guys over there and the medical guys over there, but bring them together and try to make a system that works. The hand-to-hand stuff that somebody like Cecil Birch or Larry Lindeman will teach you dovetails precisely with the shooting stuff that Tim Herron or Scott Jedlinski are going to teach you. It all has to gel together. And I think the trainers that we select for this do a just phenomenally good job of that. So again, figure out what you're the least masterful at, if you want to put it that way, and work on this and bring them up to speed.
Yeah, I had a student at last year's conference come up to me at some point and goes, wow, what you just said mirrors just off of what, and I forget what other presenter has just said, and he mirrored just off of what this other guy over here said. And I said, wow, it's like there was a plan.
Yeah, almost like it.
Yeah.
Pretty careful about who we select. Every year I get tons of requests from people. Hey, can I? No. Hey, can I teach next? No. Hey, can I present a block? No. You don't know enough yet. The people that do present are, for the most part, people with a great deal operational experience, training experience, a great deal of training of their own, and taking years to figure this stuff out, and are now passing it on to other people. So you're going to find that people that are really competent in these disciplines are going to tend to be teaching stuff that dovetails together pretty well, because we've all figured out essentially what does and what doesn't work via the school of hard knocks. And I think that's an important component of having an integrated philosophy where back in police training, it's common that the DT guys, the defensive tactic guys, teach a certain set of body mechanics. The shooting guys teach a completely different set, and they are antagonistic. If you do what the DT guy says, you can't shoot. If you do what the shooting guy says, you get your ass kicked. And they won't talk to each other. They're antagonistic. Oh, we don't talk to the DT guys. We're the gun people, and that's silly. So what we try to do is bring those guys together. I mentioned Cecil Birch several times because Cecil's a really good trainer to teach people these basic, both striking and jits moves. Well, Cecil was just in the advanced instructor class with me in Arizona a few weeks ago, continuing to work on his gun skills. So you can be sure that somebody's made his way up to advanced instructor in the range master system and black belt, Pan Am's game competitor, and BJJ is going to recognize that those two things have got to fit together, and not teach you something that would be antagonistic to your pistol skills and vice versa.
All right. Well, speaking of what works and what doesn't, I want to hit an instructor development and class design kind of vein here. I think one of the hallmarks, perhaps the biggest hallmark of the range master doctrine, is it's boiled down to the core necessities of what a person needs to walk around in the world armed. And there's not a lot of extraneous stuff.
No, what I really would like to see is all of the effort, all of the bandwidth, all the time that people sink into things like shooting on the move and flashlight techniques and this and that. That's all precious time that could have been put into developing real skill at things that actually are going to come into play. Flashlight skills for private citizen, totally relevant. I've been doing this for a living now for over 50 years. Until about 2 years ago, I was able to say I've never found a single one. I finally found one incident where a private citizen actually used a flashlight in a defensive shooting. But it happened on a pig farm in the middle of no friggin' where, with the nearest street light probably 25 miles away. Most of us don't live on a pig farm in the middle of nowhere. And in a modern urban environment, there's enough light for you to see who dude is, what he's got to do in his hand, what his dude doing. It's not that, I'm sure you've seen it too, but I've had my pistol out on 7-Eleven parking lot at 3 in the morning to see the sights better than I could at 3 in the afternoon on an overcast day. At the time of day is absolutely relevant. But in an urban environment, we're not in dark unless you go in the bank vault and close the door. Bad guys can't operate in the dark. It's another common misconception that crime occurs in a vacuum. What would a bad guy be doing in the dark? How the hell is he going to find a victim in the dark? What's the first step in selecting you as a victim? You got to see you. Then he's got to look at you. He's got to evaluate you. Do you have what I want? Can I get it away from you? And all of that requires visual input. He's not standing there in the dark feeling for a bad guy or for a victim like a catfish. He's looking at people, which means people can look at him. So the time and effort people put into that, I would much rather put into other things. There are things we know you're going to have to do. So that's the things that you should put the most effort on. For instance, I don't find nearly enough work on a good concealed carry presentation. I see people all the time show up for class, not my classes because I don't allow it, but other people's classes with a battle belt, big open carry rig. And then of course, they take all of that off, put on an IWB holster and a cover garment to go to town for dinner. So they've done all of their training from something they'll never have, which is a huge waste of time and resources. When we talk about training resources, you're talking about time, ammunition, and money. Nobody has enough of any of those. Nobody's got enough time, nobody's got enough money, nobody's got enough ammo. But what's the one thing that we got the biggest deficit on? Time. You can get enough money, you can get enough ammo, but you can't make more time. So we got to try to wring everything we can out of what time we do have available. So I would like to see a lot more emphasis on a consistent, reliable, fast, safe, efficient concealed carry presentation, Because if you have to use that gun away from your own house, which is the vast majority of the time, you may or may not have to actually fire it. You may or may not have to reload it. You may or may not have to fix a malfunction. But I guarantee you're going to have to get it out. So since we know you're going to have to get it out, I would like to see a lot more effort into that. I get some idiot every now and then will tell me a fast draw is not a big factor in civilian shooting. So let's see. I got some dude a car length away trying to kill me. Should I get it out sooner, slower, sooner, slower? Geez, I just don't know. That's silly. Every little piece of a second longer that it takes you to get that weapon out is time that you don't have to devote to making decisions you're going to have to live with the rest of your life and getting quality hits if that's the correct answer. So you got to be able to get the gun out. We got to be able to get it out safely, quickly, and efficiently. Safely means without endangering yourself or accidentally shooting somebody else. Quickly, obviously, means a very short amount of time. Shorter the better. And efficiently means into a firing platform we can actually deliver a first round hit reliably from, be confident that first round is going to be a good solid hit. And that requires kind of building the platform that we launch the bullet from. So I'd like to see a lot more emphasis on that. If you fire the gun, you're going to fire it more than you think. So I think conditioning people to go ahead and proactively reload is a good idea. Don't get in the habit of firing some unknown number of rounds and then not being queasy about the fact that your gun's no longer full. You want a full gun. So we kind of program people that when the gun starts getting low, load it back up. Don't wait till it runs out. You don't wait till you run out of gas to look for a gas station. You proactively fill your tank up. We do the same thing with your pistol. If you shot it, it's got less ammo in it than it did have. And I'll almost guarantee you it's got less than you thought. We do a little demo in every class where I've never had anybody. I'm not going to get into the details because I like people to get the full value of it in class, but nobody's ever beat it. And they're always shocked. And it just proves that, you'll have less ammo than you think. So proactively reload it. In a real fight, the gun may be jammed up against something, somebody grabbing at it, pushed up against you. You may have a less than perfect grip on it. So malfunctions are actually a lot more common in fights than we'd like them to be. So I think quickly remediating malfunction without having to stop to think about it, just the gun doesn't do what you want to do, get it fixed, get back in the fray is important. So those are the kind of things we work on a lot. A good, efficient, fast concealed carry presentation, being able to get quick, multiple hits that are anatomically valuable in a very short time frame at typical engagement distances, which is about 90%. And that's not my numbers. That's shootings, numbers from our student shootings, from the FBI's agent shootings, and DEA agent shootings, which all three wear plain civilian clothing and concealed pistols. About 90% of the crap happens between 3 and 5 yards. If you'll think about it, in our culture, and this varies from around the world, but in our culture, we talk to strangers about 3 steps, about 3 yards. And the typical American man's 16 feet long. That's 5 yards and 1 foot. So I just say a car length's about 5 yards. So if you look at it in that context, from talking to strangers at about 3 steps to the length of your car being about 5 steps, it's pretty obvious why 90% of this crap happens in that distance frame. So it's where we put the bulk of our work. Now, we do have to go beyond that some, but we don't spend a great deal of effort on that. The last 5 or 6 years, we've had 3 private citizen students, perfectly legitimate, necessary shootings, no legal issues, no nothing. One had to engage at 15, one at 17, and one at 22 yards. And they all pulled it off. I get people tell me all the time, a private citizen never be justified in shooting somebody beyond the car length. No bullshit. All 3 of these were absolutely necessary. In fact, all 3 of them saved the life of another person, not the shooter, but another person. So I think that's an important skill. So we put some effort into that. We shoot with 2 hands as a default. If you got both hands, you put them on the gun, but we don't always have 2 hands. So we work on being able to shoot with 1 hand adequately well. And that's about, in an entry-level class like a combative pistol, that's about it. Draw the gun quickly, safely, efficiently. Also, something I rarely find addressed in class, if you got it out, at some point you got to put it back away. So we got to learn how to do that in such a manner that if we're highly adrenalized, scared witless, we've just been involved in a shooting for the first time, still can put the gun away without shooting ourselves. It seems to me getting through the gunfight and then shooting ourselves is somewhat counterproductive. So we work on that a good deal. Being able to shoot with whichever hand you have, with both if we got both, but with whichever if we've only got one. Being able to reload if the gun runs low, and being able to remediate malfunctions if the gun gags. And the rest of the time is spent on things more involved with how to think. We try to remold the students' thought patterns a good bit about this, because they come to class with a lifetime of cultural indoctrination as victims. We have to try to change that. In fact, I had a psychologist go through several classes with me a few years ago. About the third one, he came to me and said, I figured out why your students are so successful in fights. I said, oh, pray tell. He said, because you give them permission to defend themselves. So all of their life, they've been told, don't fight back, don't resist, don't do this, don't do that, call somebody else, they'll make the bad man go away, which is not physically possible. I said, first time in their life, you've had them understand that they have a right not to be killed, not to be crippled, not to be raped, but that it's their job to make that happen. And that's why they're able to do well. And I agree with you. So we spend a fair bit of time in an entry-level class going over developing the correct mindset, understanding what the actual threat level is, what your actual odds are. They're not 1 in a million by a long stretch. And trying to develop that willingness. We think of it as a reluctant willingness. No, we don't want to shoot anybody, but no, I'm not going to let you kill me. I'm not going to let you cripple me. I'm not going to let you rape my child. I'm not going to let you do any of those. I'm not going to let you kill me for my car keys. I'm not going to let you kill my wife for her purse. I'm simply not going to allow that. Something I learned a long time ago as an investigator is you can't have violent crime without victims, without people willing to put up with it. When somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to unlawfully take your life, you have to be willing to say no, because nobody else is going to do that. What's the average response time for a priority 1 call around the country now? Somebody's life's in immediate, they got shots being fired, rape in progress, robbery in progress. What's the average response time for that kind of call now?
I think about 11 minutes.
That's an older number. The current one's more like closer to 17. Yeah. But take the little one, 11 minutes. Yeah. What in the hell? I don't care how highly trained, highly motivated, go-getter, best kind of cops you could possibly have. I don't care how many of those you got. There's no way in hell he can get in the time machine, go back 10.5 minutes and fix your problem. It's not physically possible. People tend to think that if they punch 3 buttons on their cell phone, A, it freezes the action, and B, it makes somebody teleport down out of the mothership next to them to deal with the problem. And that's simply not physically possible. No. Like our friend Daryl Bokie says, you're your first responder. The cops are distant second responders. You're your own first responder. A lot of truth that you're the only one's going to be there when the shit hits the fan.
Yep. I had a discussion with someone back when I was a graduate student that just didn't quite understand the equations involved with the whole situation. And we were on the 4th floor of a 4-story building. And I said, okay, here is the scenario. There is a very highly trained cop in the parking lot. Mm-hmm. The shooting starts now, active killer walking through these classrooms, killing students. How many people can that guy kill before that cop gets up 4 flights of stairs? And he's in the parking lot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. They're waiting for you.
Right. Now, if you add that he's got to drive all the way across town to get to that parking lot.
Yeah, remember, he's got to get the call first. That's got to percolate through the call dispatch system first before it even gets to him. Then he's got to drive through traffic where he is to where you are.
Right.
That's why it takes 11, 12, 13 minutes.
All right. So you've got to be able to deal with that situation now, not 11 minutes from now. Now.
Yeah, nobody's going to be kicking your front door for 11 minutes.
All right. I want to circle back to the concealed presentation for just a second, because I know I had fun on the internet making fun of the sub-second draw thing, and you made the statement that you did about every instant of time. I've seen like you teach a 2-handed garment clearance technique for a strong side IWB, clearance of the technique presentation. All right. Well, I've also heard the argument, well, if you clear with the support hand only, you're saving a fraction of a second and getting that strong hand grip on the gun. That is correct, but I also see that get flubbed more often than I see the two-handed presentation. So is there room in that math to go for the more sure technique than the quote fastest on the timer?
Yeah. That in competition shooting, tiny increments of time make a big difference because they add up. They accumulate into a significant amount of time. In a typical fight scenario, you're looking at one stage, not 12, 13, 14 stages. I would much rather have a presentation stroke that's a 1/10 of a second longer that works every time than one that's a 1/10 of a second faster, but I've screwed up every 5th time, because I guarantee you when the 5th time is going to be. I've done 4 in practice, and now Leon wants me to do a 5th one on the Walmart parking lot, and that'll be the one I fuck up. So I'm much more interested in bulletproof techniques. I very rarely see anybody really get fouled up using the technique we use, and if I do, it's somebody that would be fouled up no matter what we taught them. But I see people screw up a one-handed one pretty often. You wind up with the garment covering the last inch of the butt of the pistol and that sort of thing. And if you grab garment and gun both, that's usually, it's fixable, but it takes a lot longer than it would have simply done to do a two-hand presentation. And of course, I said, well, sometimes you won't have both, right? And the technique we teach will work with one hand. It just works better with both.
I've heard you make the statement before that all this stuff is cyclical, and that every 15 years we see things come around again and people act like it's new and it's been invented. And you've been through what, 2-3 cycles of this?
Yeah, I'm coming up on the end of the 3rd cycle now. Now, if you talk to any of the old heads, Wayne Dobbs, Darrell Rose will tell you the same thing. We just see the same crap arguments come up over and over and over and over and over and over again. The point shooting versus aim fire, and revolver versus auto, and 9mm versus 45. Those were all controversies invented by gun magazine editors, not writers. Back when print magazines were still a viable means. When I was a kid, the internet didn't exist yet. If you wanted information about guns, you went and got a gun magazine. There were 7 or 8 major publications back in those days. There was Guns Magazine, Shooting Time, Shooting Illustrated, American Handgunner, Guns Magazine, Peterson Handguns, and just on and on. I just named off, I think, 7. They were pretty much the major players. And they all had the same problem. They had to come up with enough content to fill a magazine every month. So the editors come up with that crap. I stood there. I started writing Combat Handguns magazine back in the 70s. And I've written about 150, a little over 150 published articles over the years, so just about all the major magazines. But I was present when an editor from one of the magazines, I won't say which one of the writers asked him a question about an article. He said, "What? Oh, article? Oh, you mean the crap between the ads?" And which is the way editors look at it. Their job is to sell advertising to fund the magazine. The cover cost of a print gun magazine doesn't even cover the production cost of it, and shipping it out to the retail outlet where they sell it and whatnot. The revenue comes from the ads, which is why you'll see a full-page color ad for the newest whiz-bang pistol, and happens to be on the page next to the review of the new whiz-bang pistol. It says it's the best thing since sliced bread. So back in those days, we had to be kind of careful about gun magazines. You had to kind of keep that in mind. But all those controversies were ginned up by these editors simply as a way to fill magazine space up. It's the same old crap over and over and over again. They would have false controversies where some major gun writer would take one side of the issue and another would take the other side, and just beat each other to death for 3 or 4 issues. And a lot of times neither one of them actually believed what they were doing. They were just cranking out stuff to fill in the gap between the ads. Now with the internet, it's even worse, because back in those days, you got filtered. At least the editor had to like your stuff, or the publisher had to like your stuff, see some kind of glimmer of intelligence in the writing, and that was the only way you got into a magazine. But now everybody's got a keyboard, everybody's a gun expert. So, the problem with the internet is there's an awful lot of information out there, but most of it's wrong.
And just anybody can start a podcast.
Yeah.
There you go. One thing I was going to ask earlier, and I'm going to ask it now, even though it's going to be kind of out of sequence to the conversation. As people go through their journey of going through classes, and they've moved into instructing, or they're just a student that is going in and getting exposed to new techniques, how do you boil down to, when do I make a change in my technique to this other material that I've learned, from a student or an end user perspective, and then from an instructor, course design technique, when do I stop teaching something I was teaching to make time to teach something else?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Both aspects of it are somewhat difficult, somewhat complicated. I guess we'll take it from the students' side first. What I would really encourage a student to do is do some due diligence, do some research before you start taking classes. I'm a strong proponent of training with more than one instructor, more than one school, if the material is from the same basic family of skills. You might say it's the same basic philosophy. In other words, don't take a class from somebody who's front sight centered. By that I mean has an emphasis on seeing the sights for every shot, being accountable for every shot, and using the sights to accomplish that. And then go take a class from some guy that's, oh no, you can't do that under real stress, just stick it out and shoot. That all it does is create conflict in your mind, particularly at the subconscious level, and just basically you wasted both classes. There are plenty of competent people who teach doctrine that is similar enough that you're going to continue to get benefit from it. But like I tell new instructors, you need to take people's basic entry-level pistol classes from as many different competent trainers as you can, because one of the things you need to be able to do is explain the same material in more than one way. A lot of times you'll explain something to a new student, and you give it to them 3 different explanations, and they still give you the little cocktail puppy look. Obviously don't get it. And then you tell them a 4th way, and the light bulb comes on, they suddenly understand what you're saying. Well, it's difficult, especially for a new trainer, to come up with multiple ways to explain the same technique. But if you go to several different trainers, you're going to hear several different explanations of the same technique. So I think both from a student standpoint and the instructor standpoint, that's really important. From the student standpoint, you're getting the same information in slightly different manners, slightly different presentation of it, slightly different wording of it, slightly different demonstration of it. And that really deepens your depth of understanding of that technique or skill by seeing it presented in, it's, the example you gave earlier, the guy said, this guy said essentially the same thing, and that guy said essentially the same thing, and that guy said essentially the same thing at TAC Con. That's reinforcing it into your mind a lot more than just a single trainer or a single school. Going back, training with the same guy over and over and over again, you're hearing the same information basically over and over and over again. So if you broaden that out, but stay in that same discipline, if you will, then you're going to get a lot more effective learning process. And then, like I said, with the trainer, that gives you an opportunity to find more ways to explain why it is what you do. When you tell a student do this or do that, and they look at you and say, why? You should be able to give them a coach an explanation, not because that's what they did in the academy, or that's not what the book says, or that's what Guru X told me to do. Why? What does this do? Well, if we don't learn to do this, then we could do that. And if we could do that, then we could accomplish this. But if you can't explain that to them, there's no reason for them to buy into what you're doing. That's a lot easier if you've heard it explained by several different competent trainers. So like I said before, we were talking about the synergy at TAC Con. I got to work that word in. By having a lot of trainers from a lot of different backgrounds. I mean, we have trainers from Washington State, New York State, Florida, Texas, everything in between, but all saying in a slightly different way, essentially the same thing. then it really beats it into your subconscious, which is where we need it to be for you to retain it, do anything with it, any real stress. So I think if you stay in the same basic discipline, same training family, if you will, family line, then I think that's very beneficial to you to go to different trainers and hear different ways to see this, fix the same problem, basically. And for trainers, it's absolutely necessary because you're not going to come up with all this on your own. But if you hear essentially the same thing explained, go to 5 different schools, you hear the same thing explained by 5 different people in 5 different ways, then your teaching repertoire is much, much more developed. Which is why I still try to go to schools. You know, when I've been wanting for years to take Gabe White's class. And now that I'll be 70 next year, I didn't have any hope of getting a turbo pin, but I solidly got a light pin out of it. But more importantly, I picked up a nugget that I instantly worked into our basic program that I thought was just brilliant. And that made it worth the time, effort, money to go take that class, because I got a nugget that I think makes a huge difference in what we do. Now, I'm not going to tell people what it is. I have to go take his class. But it was one of those aha moments that's really worthwhile. Well, I would not have that had I not gone to, got up off my ass and gone and taken his class. I had to make an effort to do that. Same with Ernest Langdon. I've known Ernest since 1990. No, correct. Yeah, 1996. That's a long time ago. And I've been trying for all of that time to get him on his classes, but he doesn't teach but a handful of classes a year. And typically, if I was anywhere near where he lives, he was teaching on my side of the continent and vice versa. And finally, a couple of years ago, he was teaching a few hours from my home, and I just said, screw it, and canceled a class of mine to go take his. And sure enough, he was able to point out a couple of things. And this happens to all of us. Errors creep into your technique over time. He saw something I was doing I wasn't aware of, fixed it, immediately shot better as a result. So as a trainer, you've got to make the opportunities to go and broaden your own training horizons, if you will. Go see how other people do what you're trying to do, and then so you get better at what you do. And I still do that to this day. I've been teaching now for damn near 50 years.
Right, but I just want to ask you come across new information. How do you make the value judgment of whether or not it's worth integrating into what you're teaching in your program and casting something else aside? Or I'm going to stick with what I'm doing. Yeah, that's good material, but I'm going to stay with what I've got. Well,
if anybody is teaching today what they taught 10 years ago, they need to stop teaching. That's equipment. Hell, when I went through my early training at Gunsight, if you showed up with an auto, you had 1911. Unless you were the one guy in 1,000 that showed up with the Browning high power. And that was it, period. So a lot of the techniques were 1911 centric. The malfunction clearance techniques were based on malfunctions the 1911s have. The reloading sequences were based on 7, 8 shot magazines. So the entire doctrine was built around that gun platform. Well, what we got today? I didn't think I would live this long, but about 3 years ago, I taught my first full class in Texas without a single 1911 in it. I never thought I'd live to see that day, especially in Texas. But I routinely do classes in Texas now with 20 people in class, not a single 1911 in there. None of the stuff that people show up with today existed, not just 40 years ago, didn't exist 20 years ago. H&Ks, SIG 320s, M&Ps, none of that stuff was around 20 years ago. So you have to be able to adapt as equipment technique changes. The AIWB carry is not new. People have been doing that since we started carrying pistols. I've got photographs of people on the Western frontier wearing a gun that way, not just shoved in their pants, but purpose-built AIWB holster. I've got one grizzled old lawman from Arizona. It was taken about 1930. He's got a single action army and a purpose-built appendix IWB rig. So it's nothing new. It's something that goes around in that cycle we talked about. But the modern holsters that we have for that now are so radically different from the holsters that they had 100 years ago that it's almost like being reinvented. So you got to adapt to that. So the equipment changes. Over the last 30 years, we've learned a great deal about how the mind works, both in learning and retaining physical skills and applying those skills under real pressure under duress. We found a lot of stuff we thought we knew, we didn't quite know. We know a lot more about that now. So we have to modify technique based on what we learn about how people learn physical skills, how they retain them. So basically, when I see other competent people teaching something, I see their students doing well with it. Run a few students through that way, and they do well with it. And then we say, okay, well, we'll start teaching that, and modify the techniques as we go along, because things change, the threats change. The bad guys we face on the street today are not the guys that we had 40, 50 years ago. A lot higher percentage now of people that are drunk, drugged, crazy, and all of the above. That'll make a lot of difference. The criminal justice system has changed. They don't fear it anymore. 40 years ago, for instance, by prison was a big deal. Now, okay, not a big deal. Because of advances in modern trauma care, most of the kind of thugs we really want to worry about have all been shot already. They weren't impressed. They went in. The Med Memphis treats 8, 9, 10 people a day, every day, for gunshot wounds. It's almost like an assembly line. You in one door and out the next in a couple of hours. And so everybody on the street knows numerous people that have been shot and got over it very quickly, and an awful lot of them have been shot and got over it very quickly. So pointing guns doesn't impress them like it did 40, 50 years ago. But when we didn't have modern trauma care, you were a lot more likely to die if somebody shot you. Now they realize that you're not likely at all to die unless they shoot you really well or really a lot, one or the other, or both. So that's changed the dynamic a little bit. And as I said, the equipment has changed radically. We got ammunition now we did not have 30 years ago. Numerous gun designs we didn't have 30 years ago, holster designs we didn't have 30 years ago. So if you're still teaching material that you learned 30 years ago, it's all obsolete today. So you have to adapt and change as we go along. In 1980, I would have been teaching a hard weaver with a 1911. We don't do either now. The only 1911 I still own is a Shanghai Municipal Police Colt made in 1927, because ain't nobody getting that one while I'm still alive. But that's the only 1911 I still own. I think Lynn's got one or two. But things have changed.
Yeah. Talking about how things have changed. It's amazing to me. I've been on a revolver bug here again lately.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like up until just now, because I'm out looking for revolvers, old police trade-in cop guns, where you go into any gun shop and they were all over the place, like usually sitting in a box in the corner, and they had a price tag was a couple of $100, and they were happy to go ahead and get it off their hands and get rid of it. On a local trading site today, there was a guy who had a nice Ruger Security 6 stainless posted. Didn't even have a turn line on the cylinder. And I sent him a message inquiring about it, because he'd had in a trade thing, was possibly a Glock, whatever. And I said, well, what kind of Glock are you interested in? And his response was, which two are you going to trade?
Yeah.
Wow. We have reached a complete juxtaposition of
absolutely. Yeah, when I was a rookie, if somebody sees the semi-auto, they had to call one of the gun nuts like me to come show them how to clear it. Now if one of the kids sees a revolver, you got to call one of the gun nuts to come show them how to clear it. It's really, I own more revolvers than autos. I don't carry them, but I own a whole bunch of them. I've got some that I hunt with. I've got some that are strictly historical value. But if you ride a horse to work every day and do most of your communication by telegraph, then carry a revolver. They're technological contemporaries of that equipment.
It's just it just seems so weird to me that whole thing is just flipped on its head. That a few years ago you couldn't give them away, and then now they're commanding a premium.
Part of it is that revolvers are much like 1911. The action of a Smith & Wesson revolver built yesterday is exactly the same as one that was built in 1909, over 100 years ago. It was made, and the same thing applies to 1911. It was made when skilled hand labor was cheap and plentiful, and automation was rare and expensive. In 1909, you didn't have Social Security. Nobody had retirement plans. You didn't have a pension if you worked for Smith & Wesson or Colt. You sat there at a bench for 30 or 40 or 50 years hand fitting guns until you flopped over dead one day, and then brought in the guy that you've been training for the last 20 years, moves up to your chair, and they bring in a new guy. Neither the 1911 nor the revolver are well suited to modern manufacturing techniques. When you pay $3,500 for a Wilson or a Nighthawk 1911, you're paying for that level of hand fitting that a Colt would have had in 1928, 1930. My 1927 Colt, I got a factory letter. It's one of 50 that went to the Shanghai Municipal Police, and it's got their roll markings on it and everything. But anyway, it's fitted to the level of a Nighthawk today. It's just a commercial 1911. But the assumption was, we're sending this to the Shanghai Municipal Police in Shanghai, China. Somebody's going to fight for their life for this gun not long after it gets unboxed. It'd better work or I'll get fired and I'll never get another job. And so the guns were built with that in mind. Modern revolver is that over 100-year-old action that requires a bit of hand fitting, but they don't do it anymore. They just mass produce them, send them out. Basically, what you're buying when you buy a new revolver is a box of parts, and you take somebody who knows what they're doing and make a revolver out of it. Same with the typical 1911 for anything under a couple of grand. And so what we're finding is those older guns, the $200 barrel full of Model 10s that you were talking about, are made so much better than the revolvers of today because they still had a fair degree of hand fitting involved with them. I'll give you two brand new ones for a 1950s vintage Smith or Colt anything, because they were made a hell of a lot better. They'll work, they'll hold up. But unfortunately, I can't say that about a new one. I mean, I know one guy who's had two Smith & Wessons in the last 2 or 3 years that have gone back to the factory. Both of them crapped out in the first range trip to the point of can't do anything with this guy, go back to the factory.
Yeah.
That would have been unheard of in the 40s, 50s, but unfortunately fairly common today.
Yeah, and the third generation Smith & Wesson seem to be developing a cult following all of a sudden. And I sit there and I look at that and I go, I carried one of those things. And while I have nostalgia for the one that I carried, I don't have nostalgia for any other one out there. It's amazing. I think it comes down to is when something becomes not readily available anymore, all of a sudden it gets a value attached to it. And in some cases, there's a reason why they went out of frontline usage and are not available anymore.
But I think the driving factor on the cost on those revolvers is simply that they work from that era. They're just a much better gun than you can buy today over the counter. The same thing applies to many other, applies to Remington 870s. And give me an old Wingmaster, I'll give you two brand new ones for an old Wingmaster any day. And I think that's driven the price of revolvers up a lot. That, and then they don't make nearly as many of them as people think. Smith & Wesson sells more J-frames than anything else, but in the other revolvers, they really don't make that many of them in a given year. And that drives the price up, but they're not gonna make any of the old ones.
Right.
So that's why real estate keeps going up. They don't make any more dirt. Same way with old Smith & Wesson revolvers, they're not gonna make any more of them. You couldn't put the amount of hand fitting that went into one in the 40s or 50s into one today and sell it at a price point that people would pay for it.
Yeah.
There's a reason why the performance center guns cost more, because somebody actually went through them and did the fitting that would have been done on a straight production gun 50 years ago.
All right. Well, now I'm going to throw you a complete oddball question.
All right.
Yeah. On this show, we focus in on a lot of the historical context, and we've really been on a modern technique theme over a bunch of recent episodes. And a lot of people know the names like Cooper and those like. Who out there was very important or very influential that just nobody knows about now?
Oh, well, course, the first one that comes to my mind would be Walt Comstock. Who?
Yeah.
Walt was a competitor in the Southwest Pistol League, which was the originally the Southwest Combat Pistol League, but when they incorporated, the state of California didn't like the word combat, so they dropped it, made it Southwest Pistol League. And that eventually grew into what became IPSC. Walt was an early competitor in that, and they basically came up with the hit factor scoring that everybody uses today in USPSA. They call it hit factor now. Nobody knows Comstock's name. It was originally called Comstock count. And the idea was to, I think probably the most succinct explanation of it I've heard lately is see who can get the most points per second. But basically, if you shoot slowly to get all your points, your score won't be very good. If you shoot really, really quickly but drop a whole lot of points, your score won't be very good. But if you shoot quickly and get your hits, then your score will be much better. So it's probably the most relevant way to measure defensive pistol skills. The guy who gets his hits faster wins, just like in a fight. It gets the first anatomically valuable hit, not just to hit someone on dude in that area from collarbone to diaphragm, inside the nipples. So if a guy can get a hit in that area in half the time this guy can get hit in that area, the first guy's a better shot, and Comstock count rewards that. Hit factor scoring is very widely used now, but that was one of Comstock's major contributions, and most people don't really, not enough familiar with the name at all. Mike Harries was an early instructor at Gunsight, Korean War combat veteran, early instructor at Gunsight, one of the first to look at alternative techniques, work with a flashlight and a pistol, mostly from a law enforcement context. But one of the first people to actually look at that from a informed perspective, not just accept the old FBI technique because it's the only one anybody taught. Came up with some innovations in that. So he probably doesn't get enough credit. Chuck Taylor was a very prolific writer, and early on he was the number 2 guy at Gunsight for several years. He had a whole lot of other experience beyond that, but he also wrote an awful lot for a number of different publications. So he was instrumental in getting the word out on a lot of stuff to the mainstream via those old print gun magazines that we talked about. Worked for several of them over the years. Don't agree with everything Chuck said. Don't believe a lot of what Chuck said, but a lot of what Chuck wrote was important, and it was instrumental in getting it out to the masses. People today just have no idea. Prior to the internet, information was a lot harder to come by, and relevant or useful information was really hard to come by. So there were a handful of writers that you could count on to give you some stuff that you could actually maybe take and adapt to your own needs. And Chuck was one of them. So he doesn't get as much credit as he probably should. He just passed away a couple of years ago. Those are some early pioneers. Of course, everybody's aware of Dennis Tudor's work. Dennis absolutely just hates what it's been morphed into over the years. He never intended it to be a 21-foot rule or anything like Dennis is a Mormon, doesn't curse, but when he hears the words 21-foot rule, he just turns beet red and just gets madder. He's about to pop a cork sometimes when he hears that term, but he was one of the first people to disseminate information about the fact that somebody with a contact weapon was a threat from further away than arm's length, which a very common misconception that if he's got a tire iron or a knife or a machete, he's got to be close enough to touch you with it. No, he doesn't. He's got to be close enough to get to you before you can do anything about it. And that's a lot further away than a lot of people realize. And it's not a 21-foot rule. That just happened to be where until 20 years ago, almost no pistol range in the country had anything but 7, 15, 25, and 50-yard lines. They didn't have 3s and 5s. We just added those in the last 20 years for the most part. And so the 7-yard line happened to be a convenient place for him to stand and do his initial research with his volunteers. He didn't intend that to be any kind of benchmark. If I got a guy with a knife 8 or 10 feet away from me, threatening to cut me, I'm not necessarily going to shoot him because he's 85 years old in a wheelchair and I can outrun it. So I wouldn't shoot him, even though he's way under that 21-foot mark. On the other hand, I got some guy in his early 20s, he's 6'4", and got on running shoes and right on the open parking lot with nothing between the two of us. If he's 30 feet away waving a knife, he might get shot, because how long would it take him to get over here with that knife? Less than a couple of seconds. So there is no 21-foot rule or any other distances. Given the dynamics of the current situation, what obstacles are between me and this guy? Can I put a chain link fence? Can I put a sales counter? Can I put a parked car between me and him? A distance and time are inseparable. If I buy some distance, I buy some time. What are his apparent physical abilities? Is it the 85-year-old guy in a wheelchair, or is it a late teenager with running shoes on? So there's no magic number. But Dennis's early work opened the door for that, and especially in the legal sense, and really made some changes in doctrine. And he should get a lot of credit for that. And I'm sure there are a bunch of other people. Most of us that teach are not teaching our own stuff. We're teaching the piece I got from this guy, a piece I got from that guy, a piece I got from that guy, a piece I got from that way, and put it into a program. All we really have to claim as our own is the way we string it together into a product, if you will, that we then give to other people. Very few people teaching today invented anything. They just learned about things, So Cecil Birch posted something on the internet today about reading A Rifleman Went to War by Herbert McBride, rereading it for I don't know how many time. That was written in the years between World War I and World War II. Absolutely still valuable information in it today. So somebody that's teaching some of the stuff that's covered in the book, they didn't invent that stuff. McBride was doing it in 1920. And so that's one reason I think trainers really ought to make more of an effort to learn more about the history and development of the craft, because a lot of times you make the assumption that something's new, that no, it's not new. It's third time around for it. And this is the way we used to do it, and that morphed into this, because then we got this equipment, we were able to do that. And if you don't understand the development of the technique, it's easy to think that your guru devised it, when in fact all we're doing is rediscovering it and repackaging it in many cases, including me.
All right. Is there anyone especially you would like to pay homage to as a mentor of yours?
Well, it would have to be Cooper. He was, as I said before, this is in the days before electronic communication. I had a file folder, 2 inches thick of letters from him from the late 60s and 70s, where he was patient and said, well, this kid in the Southeast, where there is no training available whatsoever, is asking the right questions, so I'll take the time to give him the right answers. When I went to my various trips to gun sight, to be honest, Jeff didn't teach me how to shoot at that point, but he taught me how to teach. And I'm forever indebted for that. Taught a lot about how to think, and a great deal about how to teach. So if I had to name one mentor, it would be Jeff.
All right.
A lot of other people have had a lot of influence, but he probably had the deepest.
There you go. Where can people find you on the internet, classes for next year, etc.?
Rangemaster.com, real complicated. Just rangemaster.com. There's a pull down menu at the top there. It's got the class schedule on it. I've got 33 classes over that part of the country covered by, bear in mind, I'm in South Florida, no further west than Texas and no further north than Pennsylvania. I've decided to turn 70 next year. I've decided to stop these ridiculous long 3 and 4 week on the road trips that I've been doing and spend more time. I've got a really nice home here in Florida. I'd like to see it more often. So starting next year, which is a big departure for me, starting next year, no further west than Texas, or further north than Pennsylvania. I just totaled it up today. This year, the year we're just finishing up, I taught in 17 cities in 11 states, taught 33 or 4 classes in 17 different cities in 11 different states. And that's a pretty hectic schedule. So I'll try to not cutting back the number of classes next year, but they're in a more compact area, and they're a lot of times just where I can knock out 3 or 4 in 1 2-week trip instead of being gone 3 days out of 5 all year like I have been.
Yeah, I've forgotten what the total number is, but one time I sat down and counted the number of states that I've been to a class or helping you with a class in, and it was double digits.
Yeah,
It's just on that. So, well, I very much thank you for all your mentorship that you've provided me over the years, and looking forward to more. Thank you for all the guidance that you've given me. And I'm sure that most of our Range Master family would sit here and say the same thing. And there's an awful lot of us now.
There are about 1,200 Range Master certified instructors in the U.S., about 50 or 60 in Europe. Like I said, between the staff and myself, we've trained over 50,000 students over the years, not counting military. We put in a good bit of time in the military after 9/11, but not counting them. And as I said a minute ago, I hit 70 next year. So my main focus now, all but maybe 3 or 4 of the classes I'm doing next year are instructor level, one level or other, either pistol instructor, advanced instructor, master instructor, or shotgun instructor development. And what I'm really trying to do is train up the next generation, get them ready to take over. A lot of us old guys are about to age out of the system. Hackathorn has retired. Clint Smith's like 75 now, Farnham 76. I think Mass is 75. I'm hitting 70 this year. So a lot of us are going to be around that much longer. So trying to make sure the next group of trainers are able to pick up where we leave off and keep things going.
Well, there you go. Any parting shots of wisdom you would like to dig in?
No, just remind yourself periodically that the stuff we do is one of the very few arenas that our typical students ever going to be involved in. Is literally life and death. So I know it's a strain, but you have to make the time to train. You have to make the time to practice. One day you'll be glad you did.
There you go. Well, thank you for coming on tonight. And we had to wait 6 weeks for you to get back home to do this episode.
I had a class in Dallas and one in Casa Grande, Arizona. So we decided, well, hell, we'll just make a little Western vacation out of it. So we went, Lynn went with me, went to Dallas and taught, and then drove out to Arizona from there. And then on the way back, stopped off in New Mexico and screwed around for a while there in the mountains, and made a kind of a mini vacation out of it, you might say. Went down to Tombstone and played tourist and all that, and came back. But trying to limit those 3-week on the road trips for next year. People are just going to have to try a little harder to come see me.
All right. Well, to the audience, once again, the numbers have continued to grow. We're recording this on Wednesday night, and we've already broken the record for the previous 30-day average based on the last episodes. And we've already broken the record that normally takes a week for us to get those numbers in. And we're 10 ahead of where we were last week already, as far as audience numbers go. So that's just the podcast numbers. The YouTube version of the spotting episodes already at over 200 as well. So, thank you, audience, that you're continuing to participate and continuing to play along. But most importantly, I thank you for your time.